clatter of silverware on porcelain was the only language spoken at l'Étoile d'Or, a hushed, reverent dialect of wealth. For Maya, a 20-year-old waitress whose life existed a universe away from this one, it was a sound she'd come to dread. It was the sound of judgment, of expectation, of a world that would chew her up and spit her out for a single misplaced fork. Tonight, that sound was a war drum, and the battle was coming for her. You people need to learn your place. You exist to serve, not to think. The voice, belonging to a woman named Eleanor Vance, dripped with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been told no. It sliced through the restaurant's opulent silence, sharp and venomous. This wasn't just a complaint about a water glass filled a millimeter too high. This was a declaration of caste, a reminder that in this gilded cage, Maya was less than human. She was an object, a function, a pair of hands attached to an apron. Maya's own hands, tucked behind her back, trembled. She was a student at City College, studying chemistry with a focus on enology, the science of wine. She dreamed of vineyards, of creating something beautiful from soil and sun. But dreams didn't pay for her mother's mounting medical bills. Her mother, fighting a battle with lupus that drained her strength and their savings, was the reason Maya stood here, absorbing the venom of a woman whose diamond bracelet probably cost more than their apartment. Across the table from Eleanor Vance sat Julian Croft. He was a man carved from granite and silence, a titan of industry whose name was whispered in boardrooms with a mixture of fear and awe. He hadn't looked at Maya once, his attention fixed on the business associate across from him. He was a ghost at the table, a spectre of immense power who was utterly indifferent to the small, ugly drama unfolding at his elbow. To him, Maya was just part of the scenery, as inconsequential as the flickering candlelight. But here's the truth about the quiet corners of American life, the places where power and privilege dine. The cruelty isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's the background radiation of a system built on hierarchies, a system that teaches the wealthy that their comfort is paramount and the service class is invisible. And sometimes, like tonight, that invisibility wasn't enough. Sometimes, the powerful needed to remind the powerless of their station, just to feel the security of their own. The racism and classism Maya faced weren't loud and overt like a protest sign. They were quiet, insidious, woven into the fabric of a condescending glance, a dismissive wave of the hand, the deliberate use of the phrase, "you people." It was a poison that didn't always kill you outright, but corroded your soul one microscopic dose at a time. Maya looked at Eleanor Vance, at her perfectly coiffed silver hair, her surgically tightened skin, the bored disgust in her eyes, and Maya felt that familiar, weary ache in her chest. It wasn't shock. She'd been ignored at counters while white customers who arrived after her were served first. She'd been told her natural hair was a bit much for a fine dining establishment. She'd learned to code switch, to soften her voice, to make her presence as small and unthreatening as possible just to survive a shift. At 20, she'd already earned a PhD in the art of self-erasure. But this, being told she existed only to serve while her mind was buzzing with the molecular structure of tannins and esters, while her heart was breaking with worry for her mother. This felt different. This felt like a deliberate attempt to extinguish the last flicker of her spirit. "Mum," Maya said, her voice a carefully constructed masterpiece of professional calm, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I apologize if the service has not met your expectations. How may I correct it? You can start by understanding that when I ask for sparkling water, I expect it to be from the Italian Alps, not some glorified tap water from France. Are you incapable of understanding simple geography?" Eleanor hissed, her voice low enough to be a private torment, but loud enough for Julian Croft to hear if he cared to listen. He didn't. Maya's mother was fighting an autoimmune disease, a war within her own body. And Maya was here, fighting a war over the origin of bottled water. The absurdity of it was a bitter pill. She thought of the small, worn notebook in her locker, filled with detailed notes on fermentation, on soil composition, on the delicate dance of acid and sugar that makes a perfect wine. That was who she was. This trembling, apologizing shell was just a costume she wore to pay the bills. Around them, the other diners existed in a bubble of willful ignorance. A couple at the next table laughed, oblivious. A group of businessmen talked loudly about stock options. They were all complicit in their silence, their inattention creating the perfect environment for Eleanor's cruelty to fester. The restaurant manager, a man named Philip with a perpetually nervous expression, hovered near the kitchen door, watching but doing nothing. He knew who signed the biggest checks. Eleanor wasn't finished. "I want a new waitress, someone with a bit more refinement, someone who understands the standards of a place like this." The words were a direct shot, designed to get her fired, to take away the one thing she desperately needed to care for her family. Philip, the manager, finally scurried over, his face a mask of panicked apology, aimed squarely at Eleanor. "Mrs. Vance, my deepest apologies. Is there a problem?" "The problem," Eleanor said, gesturing at Maya as if she were a piece of stained linen, "is her. She's incompetent." Philip didn't even look at Maya. "I understand completely. I'll handle it. She will be removed from your table immediately." And just like that, Maya was erased, dismissed, deemed unworthy. But as she turned to walk away, her eyes met Julian Croft's for the first time. It was a brief, fleeting glance. There was no sympathy in his gaze, no anger on her behalf. There was only a flicker of something cold and analytical. He was observing a data point, a minor variable in his evening's equation. Then he looked away, back to his business, dismissing her as thoroughly as Eleanor had. If you believe that a person's worth isn't determined by their job title or the color of their skin, keep reading. If you think that the wealthy and powerful should be held to the same standards of human decency as everyone else, you need to see what happens in the next 5 minutes. And if you've ever been made to feel small, invisible, or worthless by someone who had power over you, drop a comment below and share your story. We are listening. What Eleanor Vance does next will turn your stomach. But what Julian Croft eventually does will stop the world. Hit that like button if you stand for dignity and respect for all, and subscribe, because we expose the stories of injustice that happen behind the closed doors of the 1%. The story isn't over. The real horror is about to begin. To understand the full weight of what was about to happen, you need to understand the world Maya came from. It wasn't a world of Michelin stars and vintage wines. It was a world of fourth-floor walk-ups in the Bronx, of long bus rides to the community clinic, of a mother, Maria, whose hands, once strong enough to knead dough and fix anything that broke, were now so swollen with arthritis from her lupus that she could barely hold a teacup. Maya was a product of that world's resilience. She was a scholarship kid, the first in her family to go to college. Her father had died when she was 10, a construction worker who fell from a scaffold, leaving them with nothing but grief and a stack of bills. From that day on, it had been Maya and her mother against the world. Maria worked as a seamstress, her fingers flying, her back aching, to give Maya a chance at a different life. A life where her daughter's mind, not just her hands, would be valued. When Maria got sick, their roles reversed. Maya, at 18, became the breadwinner, the caregiver, the rock. She enrolled in City College because it was what she could afford, and she chose chemistry because it felt solid, real, a world of rules and predictable reactions that was the opposite of their chaotic life. The fascination with oenology came from a guest lecture, a professor who spoke of wine not as a luxury drink, but as a living history, a complex blend of science and art, a story of the land captured in a bottle. For a girl whose own story felt so small and constrained, it was intoxicating. She took the job at L'Étoile d'Or because it paid more than any other waitressing gig. The tips, on a good night, could cover a week of her mother's medication. But the cost was high. Every shift was a performance. She had to learn a new language of etiquette, a new posture of deference. She studied the wine list with the same intensity she studied her textbooks, memorizing vintages, regions, pairings. She even got into a small, whispered argument with the head sommelier once, gently pointing out that the 2005 Bordeaux he was recommending was from a notoriously weak vintage for that particular chateau. He'd glared at her, humiliated to be corrected by a waitress, but she'd been right. Her knowledge was a secret weapon, a private rebellion in a place that demanded her mindlessness. Julian Croft, the man at table 7, came from a different world entirely. He hadn't been born into it. He'd clawed his way up from the steel towns of Pennsylvania, fueled by a ferocious intelligence and a rage against the poverty that had crushed his family. His father was a union steelworker, his mother a cleaner at the local bank. He remembered his mother coming home, her hands raw from chemical cleansers, telling stories of the bankers who looked right through her, who dropped trash on the floor she had just mopped without a second thought. That memory was the engine of his ambition. He'd built an empire in finance, not to join their world, but to conquer it. Now, he was 55, a man who could make markets tremble with a single phone call, but the anger that drove him had cooled into a kind of weary cynicism. He saw the world for what it was, a brutal, transactional place. He expected people to be selfish, cruel, and greedy. He was rarely disappointed. He'd chosen L'Étoile d'Or for this dinner because its privacy was legendary, the perfect place to negotiate a hostile takeover. The last thing he wanted was a scene. And now, a scene was precisely what he had. Philip, the manager, was bowing and scraping before Eleanor Vance, offering complimentary champagne, desserts, anything to smooth her ruffled feathers. He sent a new waiter over, a young man named David, who approached the table with the trepidation of a soldier entering a minefield. Maya was in the staff hallway, leaning against a cold tile wall, trying to force the air back into her lungs. Fired. She was going to be fired. How would she tell her mother? How would they pay the rent, buy the prescriptions? The panic was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart. But Philip didn't fire her. That would be too simple, too merciful. Instead, he came back to the hallway, his face pinched with fury. "What did you do?" he hissed. "Do you know who she is? The Vances are patrons. They spend more in a month than you make in a year. You are going to go back out there, and you are going to apologize. You will stand by her table and assist David with whatever he needs. You will be invisible, you will be silent, and you will be humble. Do you understand?" It was a punishment worse than being fired. It was a ritual of degradation. He was forcing her to return to the scene of her humiliation and serve as a silent testament to Eleanor's power. With lead in her feet, Maya walked back into the dining room. She took her position a few feet from the table, her eyes fixed on the floor, her body rigid with shame. David was taking their order, his voice trembling slightly. Eleanor saw Maya standing there and a slow, cruel smile spread across her face. She had won. She had not only had Maya removed, but had her brought back as a living trophy of her victory. "Oh, look," Eleanor said to her husband, a portly man who had remained silent through the whole exchange. "They've brought back the help to watch and learn." It was then that she decided to order the wine. She waved away the sommelier David was trying to summon. "No, I don't need his help. I want that one." She pointed a long, manicured finger at the wine list. The 1982 Petrus. A hush fell over the staff, who were close enough to hear. Even Julian Croft, who had been deep in conversation, looked up. The 1982 Petrus was not just a wine. It was a legend. A bottle of it could cost upwards of $40,000. It was the kind of wine you bought at auction, not ordered off a menu. L'Étoile d'Or had exactly one bottle, kept in a temperature-controlled vault, more of a museum piece than a beverage. Maya knew the wine. She had read about it, studied its history, the perfect weather of its vintage, the low-yield Merlot grapes that gave it its mythical status. To order it was not an act of connoisseurship. It was an act of obscene financial violence, a way of setting fire to a pile of money just to watch it burn. Eleanor was looking directly at Maya as she ordered it, a challenge in her eyes. "See what I can do? See how little this means to me?" The sommelier, a proud Frenchman named Jean-Luc, who had initially dismissed Maya, now approached the table with the reverence of a priest. The bottle was presented in a velvet-lined cradle. The ritual of opening it began. And that's when it happened. As Jean-Luc was carefully decanting the wine, Eleanor shifted in her seat. Her arm, adorned with the heavy diamond bracelet, knocked against the decanter. A splash of the ruby-red, $40,000 wine arced through the air and landed directly on the sleeve of her white silk blouse. A collective gasp went through the room. Eleanor stared at the stain for a moment, and then her head snapped up. Her eyes, filled with a terrifying, theatrical rage, did not land on Jean-Luc, who was stammering apologies. They landed on Maya. "You!" she shrieked, standing up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. "You did this! You distracted me! You have been staring at me with your insolent eyes since you came back! You ruined my dress! You ruined this wine!" It was a lie so audacious, so completely disconnected from reality, that Maya's mind went blank. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She had barely breathed. I didn't do anything," Maya whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Don't lie to me." Eleanor's voice was now a full-blown scream, shattering the restaurant's sacred quiet. Every diner was staring now. The bubble of ignorance had burst. "You wanted this to happen? It's revenge, isn't it? Because I pointed out your incompetence." She lunged toward Maya, but she didn't slap her. She did something far more humiliating. She grabbed a linen napkin from the table, dipped it in her water glass, and thrust it at Maya. "Clean it," she commanded, holding out her wine-stained sleeve. "You're the help. Clean my dress. On your knees." The entire restaurant was silent, watching. Philip, the manager, was frozen in horror, too cowardly to intervene. Julian Croft's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, for the first time, were focused entirely on the scene. He was watching, calculating, his mind processing the raw, ugly data of human cruelty. And Maya stood there, faced with an impossible choice: kneel and surrender the last shred of her dignity, or refuse and lose the job that was her mother's lifeline. The $40,000 bottle of wine sat on the table, a silent witness. But it wasn't just a bottle. It was a weapon. And in Eleanor Vance's hands, it was about to draw blood. The world seemed to slow down. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the murmur of conversations, the soft music, all of it faded into a dull roar in Maya's ears. All she could see was Eleanor Vance's face, contorted with a rage that seemed ancient and profound, her outstretched arm demanding submission. On your knees. Maya's mind raced. She saw her mother's tired smile, felt the phantom weight of her hand on her cheek. Mija, you have a fire in you. Don't ever let anyone put it out. Her mother had sacrificed everything for Maya's dignity, for the chance that her daughter would never have to bow her head to anyone. And so, Maya made a choice. She did not kneel. She stood her ground, her spine straight, and looked Eleanor Vance directly in the eye. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the cavernous silence of the room like a gunshot. For a moment, Eleanor looked genuinely stunned, as if her dog had just recited Shakespeare. The idea that a waitress, a person like her, would refuse a direct command was so foreign to her experience that it short-circuited her brain. The shock quickly curdled into a new, more volcanic level of fury. "What did you say to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "I said no," Maya repeated, her own voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I will not kneel and clean your dress. I did not spill the wine, and I will not be punished for something I didn't do." Julian Croft leaned forward slightly, his dinner forgotten. His business associate started to say something, but Croft silenced him with a barely perceptible movement of his hand. He was no longer a passive observer. He was a witness. Eleanor's face turned a mottled, unhealthy red. This was the ultimate transgression. It was not just disobedience. It was a challenge to her entire worldview, to the natural order of things as she understood it. She looked around the room, at the sea of faces watching her, and she knew she had to reassert her dominance in the most brutal way possible. Her authority had been questioned, and it had to be violently restored. "You insolent little," she began, her voice cracking with rage. Her eyes darted around the table, searching for a weapon, for something to punctuate her fury. They landed on the source of the conflict, the majestic, heavy bottle of 1982 Petru. In one swift, shocking motion, she seized the bottle by its neck. It was 3/4 full, thick glass, weighing several pounds. She raised it high over her head. Time stopped. Maya saw the bottle silhouetted against the crystal chandelier, a dark, terrible club. She saw the madness in Eleanor's eyes. She saw Philip, the manager, take a step forward and then freeze, a portrait of utter cowardice. She saw the flash of dozens of cell phone cameras, the diners transformed from a jury into a ghoulish audience. She had no time to run, no time to even raise her arms. The bottle came down. It wasn't a wild swing. It was deliberate, aimed, and full of force. It struck Maya on the side of her head, just above her temple. The sound was not the clean crack she might have expected. It was a sickening, wet thud, a sound of heavy glass meeting bone and flesh. A starburst of white-hot pain exploded behind Maya's eyes. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side. For a single, lucid second, she felt a warm liquid, her own blood, trickling down her face, matting in her hair. She saw Julian Croft rising from his chair, his face no longer stone, but a mask of dark, terrible fury. Then the world tilted. The floor, a polished expanse of black and white marble, rushed up to meet her. Her head struck the hard surface with a second, echoing crack. The lights of the chandelier above her blurred into a single, blinding sun, and then a pinprick, and then nothing. Blackness. A profound and terrifying silence swallowed her whole. Maya's body went limp on the floor of l'Étoile d'Or, a crumpled figure in a black and white uniform, a pool of blood beginning to form a dark halo around her head. She was unconscious before the first scream erupted from a nearby table. Eleanor Vance stood over her, breathing heavily, the neck of the bottle still clutched in her hand. A few drops of the priceless wine, mixed with Maya's blood, dripped onto the pristine marble. She looked down at the still form on the floor, not with horror or remorse, but with a look of grim satisfaction. She had put the help back in her place. She had restored order. The restaurant exploded into chaos. People were shouting, screaming. A woman was sobbing. David, the young waiter, looked like he was going to be sick. Philip, the manager, finally unfroze, rushing not to Maya's side, but to Eleanor's. "Mrs. Vance! Oh my God! Are you all right?" he babbled, his priorities grotesquely clear. "She provoked me," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but defiant. "You all saw it. She was insubordinate. She threatened me." But her narrative was already being drowned out by another, far more powerful voice. Julian Croft was on his feet, his chair knocked over behind him. He moved with a speed and purpose that was terrifying. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. His voice was unnervingly calm, but it cut through the hysteria like a surgeon's scalpel. "Somebody call 911. Now," he commanded. And the authority in his tone was so absolute that 3 people fumbled for their phones at once. He knelt beside Maya, his movements surprisingly gentle. He felt for a pulse in her neck, his fingers brushing against the warm, sticky blood. His expression was grim. "Pulse is weak and thready. She's alive. But she needs help immediately." He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room, and it was like a physical force. The diners, the staff, everyone froze under the weight of it. His eyes finally landed on Eleanor Vance, who was now being shielded by her husband and the pathetic, fawning manager. Eleanor met his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty finally entering her eyes. She recognized him now. Everyone in her world knew who Julian Croft was. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an excuse, an alliance of the wealthy against the fallen servant. She never got the chance. Julian Croft pulled out his phone. His fingers moved with cold, precise efficiency. He made a call, but he didn't speak to the police or a lawyer. He spoke to someone far more powerful. "It's me," he said, his voice a low growl. "Execute the Vanguard Protocol. Target is Vance Industries. Full asset freeze, effective immediately. And get a message to the board of directors at Sterling Bank. Tell them their largest shareholder is invoking the character clause on Robert Vance's personal and corporate credit lines. I want him ruined before the sun comes up." He paused, listening. "I don't care about the market disruption. Burn it all down." He hung up. The Vances and Philip stared at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. It was the sound of a world ending. Julian Croft made a second call. "Get me the best neurotrauma team at Mount Sinai. Tell them I'm bringing them a patient, and tell them my foundation is endowing their entire department. I want them waiting at the door." He stood up, towering over them, his suit jacket now stained with a smear of Maya's blood. He looked at Eleanor Vance, and the cold cynicism in his eyes had been replaced by something that looked chillingly like the ghost of the furious, impoverished boy from Pennsylvania. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, which made it all the more terrifying. "You thought she was invisible. You thought she didn't matter. You thought I was one of you." He took a step closer, and for the first time in her pampered, privileged life, Eleanor Vance looked truly afraid. My mother used to clean floors on her hands and knees, Julian Croft said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. She cleaned up after people like you, people who looked through her, who sneered at her, who believed their comfort was bought with her degradation. I swore on her grave that I would spend my life breaking people like you. He pointed a trembling finger at Maya's unconscious form, where paramedics were now beginning to work frantically. You didn't just assault a waitress tonight, Eleanor. You assaulted my mother's memory. And for that, there is no price you can pay that will be high enough. But I promise you, I will spend the rest of your miserable life finding out what it is. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The flashing red and blue lights began to dance across the restaurant's panicked, well-heeled patrons. Eleanor Vance's world. So, the first breath was a betrayal, a searing intake of air that smelled of sterility and bleach, a scent that scraped the inside of her skull raw. It was the smell of surrender, of bodies scrubbed clean of their own stories. For a long, unmeasurable time, this chemical sharpness was the entirety of Maya's world. Sound was a distant, submarine, pressure against her ears. Light was a dull orange pain behind her eyelids. Her own body was a foreign country, a landscape of dull aches, and one singular, incandescent point of agony that pulsed in rhythm with a machine's soft, metronomic beep. Memory returned not as a flood, but as jagged shards of glass floating in a dark water. The clink of a diamond bracelet against a water glass. A voice, thin and cruel, saying, "You people." The weight of shame, heavy as a shroud, and then a shape, dark, heavy, silhouetted against the blinding sun of a crystal chandelier, the shape of a bottle raised like a cudgel. Her eyes fluttered open. The world swam into a painful, disjointed focus. White ceiling tiles, a metal stand holding a clear bag of fluid, a tube snaking down to the back of her hand, a chair, occupied. A man, still as a statue, sat bathed in the weak afternoon light filtering through the blinds. His suit was gone, replaced by a simple, dark grey cashmere sweater that seemed to absorb the light around it. His gaze was fixed on a tablet, his face a study in grim concentration. Julian Croft. A sound, a dry, rasping thing, escaped her throat. It was meant to be a word, but it came out as nothing more than the rustle of dead leaves. It was enough. His head lifted slowly. His eyes, the color of wet slate, met hers. There was no surprise in them, no relief. It was the look of an engineer observing a machine that had finally sputtered back to life. "You're awake," he said. It was not a question, but a diagnosis. He placed the tablet on the bedside table, the gesture precise and final. Maya tried to push herself up, to reclaim some sense of control over her own body, but a bolt of white fire shot from her temple down to her jaw. The room tilted violently, the window and the door swapping places in a nauseating lurch. A groan tore from her lips as she fell back into the pillows, the sterile scent of the room now mingled with the sour tang of bile rising in her throat. "Don't!" he commanded, his voice sharp but not unkind. The doctors call it a traumatic brain injury, with a non-displaced temporal fracture. In layman's terms, a woman with more money than sense tried to cave your skull in. You've been unconscious for the better part of 3 days. 3 days. The number was an abyss. 3 days of her life, stolen. 3 days of silence. A cold, frantic terror, more potent than the pain, seized her. It was a mother-shaped terror. "Mama," she whispered, the word a prayer, a wound. "My mother? She doesn't know. I have to call her. Where is my phone?" Her hand, the one without the IV, scrabbled uselessly against the starched sheets, a frantic, bird-like motion. She knows. Croft's voice softened, losing its metallic edge. She is here. Maya stared at him, the words failing to connect. Here? In the waiting room? No. Here in the hospital. As a patient. I had her transferred from the clinic in the Bronx. The statement was so audacious, so utterly beyond the realm of possibility, that Maya could only blink. He spoke of moving a human being, her mother, as if he were rerouting a piece of cargo. You can't. She has her doctors, her routine. Her doctors were competent, he interrupted, with the air of a man who does not suffer challenges to his logistics. Her new doctor is Dr. Alanush Markarian, the head of rheumatological research for the entire Mount Sinai system. Her new routine involves a private room on the 16th floor, a view of Central Park, and access to experimental treatments not yet available to the general public. Her care, past, present, and future, has been endowed. She will never see a bill again. He delivered this information with the flat affect of a man reading a stock ticker. It was too much. The pain in her head, the confusion, the sheer, gravitational force of his power. It was a tide, and she was drowning in it. Why? The word was small, fragile, the only piece of driftwood she could cling to. Why are you doing any of this? He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. For the first time, he looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person. The lines around his eyes deepened. Because on the night you were assaulted, I sat at that table for 6 full minutes while Eleanor Vance verbally dismantled you. I was irritated by the disturbance. I was annoyed by the poor acoustics of her cruelty. I was inconvenienced. My only thought was of how this unpleasantness might delay the closing of my deal. His gaze dropped to his hands. My mother spent 34 years on her hands and knees, scrubbing the floors of a bank in Scranton. She scrubbed around the feet of people like the Vances, people who saw her as part of the architecture. I used to watch her come home, her knuckles raw and bleeding, and I would feel a rage so pure it was like a furnace in my chest. I built an empire on the heat of that furnace. I became what I am so I would never have to feel that helpless again. And then I sat at that table, a king in my own kingdom, and I watched another man's mother's daughter be treated like dirt, and I did nothing. I was inconvenienced. He looked up, and the slate of his eyes had become a storm. That inaction has a cost, Miss Garcia. This is the first installment on a debt I intend to pay in full. It was not an apology. It was a reckoning, a confession from a man who likely never confessed anything. He was not helping her out of kindness. He was exercising his own ghosts, using his immense wealth as the holy water. The realization was chilling, but it was also, strangely, grounding. This was a world she understood, a world of transactions. The door to the room opened, and a woman entered. It was her mother. Maria Garcia looked smaller in the vast, sterile room, her worn cardigan, a soft, defiant splash of color against the unrelenting white. But her eyes, the same dark, intelligent eyes as Maya's, were filled with a fire that could have lit up the entire city. She rushed to the bedside, her hands hovering over Maya, afraid to touch, to break the fragile reality of her daughter being awake. "Mia," Maria breathed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Oh, my sweet girl. I was so scared." "Mama," Maya cried, the tears finally coming, hot and cleansing. "I'm okay." Maria's hand finally landed on her cheek, the touch infinitely gentle. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly strong. She ignored Julian Croft completely, her entire universe shrinking to the space of the hospital bed. They spoke in a rapid, hushed Spanish, a language of home and heart, of whispered fears and fierce reassurances. Maria explained how a quiet woman in a severe suit had appeared at her apartment, explaining there had been an incident and that Mr. Croft was handling everything. She spoke of the private ambulance, the bewildered doctors, the room that looked like a hotel suite. "This man," Maria said, finally glancing at Croft, her voice switching back to a formal, wary English. "He has the power of a king. He has the resources to correct an imbalance," Croft stated, inclining his head slightly toward her, a gesture of respect. "What happened to them?" Maya asked, her voice stronger now, anchored by her mother's presence. "The Vances." Croft picked up the tablet from the nightstand. "Actions like assets have consequences. They are rarely immediate for people like the Vances, so I took the liberty of accelerating the process." He turned the screen toward her. It showed a montage of news clippings, security footage, and cell phone videos. The first was a crystal-clear, horrifyingly intimate video from a nearby table. It showed the whole scene. Eleanor's shriek, the seizure of the bottle, the brutal, deliberate swing, and Maya's limp fall to the marble floor. It was visceral, undeniable. That video had 50 million views worldwide before the sun came up, Croft said, his voice devoid of emotion. Eleanor Vance became, overnight, the face of entitled cruelty. She was arrested for felony assault with a deadly weapon. Her husband posted her $1 million bail. He swiped the screen. A new set of headlines appeared. Vance Industries stock plummets, 80% in pre-market trading. CEO Robert Vance faces shareholder revolt. Sterling Bank freezes all Vance corporate and personal assets. Robert Vance's business empire was a house of cards built on leverage and a reputation for ruthlessness. I simply provided the gust of wind, an anonymous and entirely truthful tip to the SEC regarding certain undeclared offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands triggered a federal investigation. His board of directors, seeing the reputational and financial tsunami heading their way, voted to oust him. His friends have stopped taking his calls. His world, as he knew it, ceased to exist by the time you were out of surgery. Maya stared at the screen, a cold dread creeping up her spine. This wasn't justice. It was annihilation. He had taken their lives and systematically unwritten them. He had wielded his power like a weapon of mass destruction, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind. It didn't make her feel safe. It made her feel terrifyingly small, a pawn in a war between titans, her body the battlefield. You destroyed them," she whispered. "I exposed them," Croft corrected, his tone precise. Their world was a fiction held together by arrogance and the silence of people like me. I simply turned on the lights. He set the tablet aside. They will try to fight, of course. Their lawyers will attempt to paint you as a disgruntled, unstable employee. They will fail. There are 24 witnesses and a viral video. The restaurant, L'Étoile d'Or, has already been named in a civil suit my lawyers filed on your behalf. Their insurance company has already offered a preliminary settlement in the 8-figure range. I instructed them to reject it as insulting. Maria, who had been listening with a fierce, protective stillness, finally spoke. "Money does not heal a broken head, Mr. Croft." "No," he agreed, meeting her gaze. "It does not. But it can buy the time and the space for healing to occur. It can build a new foundation where the old one was shattered." He turned his attention back to Maya. The intensity in his eyes was unnerving. "The doctors have laid out a long road for you. Months of physical and cognitive therapy, headaches, memory lapses, vertigo. They are optimistic for a full recovery, but the one thing they are certain of is that your life as a waitress is over." The words, meant to be a comfort, landed like a blow. That job, that humiliating, soul-crushing job, was her family's lifeline. It was gone. The old panic began to bubble up, the familiar fear of rent and bills and prescription costs. What will I do? The question was for her mother, for herself, for the uncaring universe. Croft seemed to anticipate the direction of her thoughts. I told you I was paying a debt. The settlement will ensure your financial security for the rest of your life. But security is a cage if it is not paired with purpose. He paused, his gaze searching her face. Tell me about the wine. The question was so unexpected, it reset the room. The wine? The 1982 Petrus. When Mrs. Vance ordered it, I saw your expression. It wasn't envy. It wasn't awe. It was disappointment. Why? The fog in her brain seemed to clear for a moment, replaced by the familiar clarity of her passion. Because she didn't want the wine, Maya said, the words coming easily now. She wanted the price tag. That bottle is a miracle. It's the story of a perfect year. A dry, hot summer, just enough rain in August, a low yield of Merlot grapes with skins so thick the tannins would be almost poetic. It's supposed to be a transcendent experience, a conversation with history. She ordered it like it was a prop, a weapon to prove how much she could afford to waste. It was a sacrilege. As she spoke, she forgot the pain, the hospital, the man in the chair. She was back in her world, the world of esters and terroir, of science and soul. She spoke of the worn notebook in her locker, of her dream to one day stand in a field, crush a grape between her fingers, and understand the story of the soil it came from. Croft listened, his head tilted slightly, an unreadable expression on his face. When she finished, a long silence filled the room. My mother, he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, could fix anything. A broken radio, a leaky pipe, a child's heart. She had an engineer's mind, a poet's hands, and she spent her life scrubbing other people's filth. The world never got to see what she could have built because it was too busy admiring the shine on the floors she polished. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling city. The greatest tragedy in the world is not poverty or cruelty. It is wasted potential. He turned back, his silhouette framed against the bright sky. When you are discharged, a car will take you and your mother to a furnished apartment I have leased for you on the Upper West Side. You will focus on your recovery. That is your only job. When your doctors clear you, a jet will take you to Napa Valley. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. I own a vineyard there, Oak Haven Estate. It is beautiful, historic, and criminally mismanaged. Its wines are adequate. I detest adequacy. I am bringing in a new master vintner from Bordeaux to run it. Your name is on his list. You will be his chief apprentice. You will live on the estate. Your full tuition for the oenology program at UC Davis is endowed. You will be paid a salary commensurate with your position. This is not a gift, Ms. Garcia. It is an investment. I am investing in potential that will not be wasted. Speechless, Maya looked at her mother. Maria's eyes were wide, glistening with tears, but on her lips was the ghost of a smile. She saw it for what it was, not charity, but a chance. The chance she had worked her entire life to give her daughter. And one more thing, Croft said, walking toward the door. He paused, his hand on the handle. The restaurant. Philip, the manager, was terminated. The negative press has been catastrophic for them. The parent company's stock is in freefall. They approached me yesterday, desperate to stop the bleeding. They offered me a controlling interest in the entire restaurant group in exchange for my public forgiveness and a promise to drop the lawsuit. He turned to face them, and for the first time, a genuine, mirthless smile touched his lips. I accepted the offer this morning. L'Étoile d'Or will close next week for extensive renovations. It will reopen in 3 months, under new management and a new name. He looked directly at Maria Garcia, a woman he had never spoken to before this day. It will be called Maria's Table. I find myself in need of a new general manager, someone with an eye for detail, impeccable standards, and an intolerance for injustice. Someone who knows what it means to build a life from scratch with nothing but her own 2 hands. The position is yours, Mrs. Garcia, if you will have it. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply nodded once, a gesture of completed business, and left, closing the door softly behind him. The silence he left in his wake was profound. It was the silence of a world remade. Maya looked at her mother, whose face was a canvas of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, fierce pride. Tears were now streaming freely down Maria's cheeks. "A seamstress," Maria whispered, looking at her own hands, the knuckles swollen from arthritis but still strong. "All my life, I have followed the patterns of others. Now, I get to draw my own." Maya lay back against the pillows, the throbbing in her head, a dull, distant drumbeat now, overshadowed by the thunder in her heart. Julian Croft had not saved her. Salvation was too gentle a word for what had happened. He had waged a war on her behalf, burned her old world to the ground, and from the ashes offered her the materials to build a new one. It was a terrifying, breathtaking, and brutal form of grace. The tears came again, but they were different now. They were not tears of pain or fear. They were the tears of a deep, seismic shift, the feeling of a lifetime of struggle falling away to reveal a horizon she had never dared to imagine. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and bruised gold, the colors of a fine, aging Cabernet. The battle was over. The vintage of her new life was just beginning.